All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Northwest RISC Regional Invasive Species Spring and Climate Change Spring webinar, Risks and Regulation of Invasive Plants in a Changing Climate. I'm Catherine Braddock, a scientist with EcoAdapt and member of the Northwest RISC Network. I'm joined today by my colleague, Deb Rudnick, who will be a co-moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to go through a few items before we get started with our presentation. So as you've probably noticed, when you joined, all audience members are automatically on mute and your cameras are turned off. We will have the option at the end of our webinar today when we do our Q&A to unmute the audience so you can ask questions to the presenters. If you have any technical issues at all, please feel free to reach out to Deb via her seller email, which are on the slide and will also be sent to you in your chat function. You can also, or question function, you can also use that question function to ask organizers and presenters questions directly. We are recording this webinar today and it will be available on the Northwest RISC website and YouTube channel. You should be able to see a handout that's been provided in your control panel. This handout includes speaker information as well as more detailed descriptions of presentations, resources, and different ways to interact with the Northwest RISC Network. During the presentations, we ask that you use that question function to submit any questions that you'd like to ask our presenters during the Q&A. So this should be the screen you are looking at as an audience member. I just wanted to point out a few functions in your control panel since GoToWebinar is a little different than what some of us might use regularly. So right here is a drop-down menu for your audio and speaker. So if you're having any audio issues, please check that first. And during the Q&A, you can use that to control your speaker, your microphone. You can use this icon right here to make our webinar full screen. This is the questions function where you can put your questions or comments or report your technical concerns. And then here is an icon to raise your hand, which I'll talk about a little more during our Q&A. So I'd like to briefly introduce the Northwest RISC Network. The network focuses on exploring on-the-ground management, conservation, and research needs and opportunities that are unique to the Northwest. We focus mainly on Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia, but we also frequently consider the management and research needs of neighboring states and provinces. The Northwest RISC Network is modeled after the Northeast RISC Network, which pioneered the RISC model in general. We're also a part of a group of other regional networks that are in the Pacific Islands, Southeast, and North Central. I would like to point out that the Northwest RISC Network wouldn't be possible without the financial support of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Northwest CASC, as well as the input and support of our advisory team. I'd also like to point out that the network wouldn't be possible without all of those who engage and participate and support the network as well. So thank you all for joining us here today and supporting the network. I am happy to introduce our presenters for today. We have Irene Weber, who is a vegetation ecologist with the Natural Heritage Program of the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and Emily Fusco, who is an ORISE Applied Climate Change Fellow with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. And with that, I am going to pass the controls over to Irene to start her presentation.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Just going to turn off one thing and then All right, hopefully everybody can see that okay. All right, so my name is Irene Weber. I work for the Natural Heritage Program for the, which is within the Department of Natural Resources. And I'm here to talk to you all today about a project we're working on looking at the ecological impact ratings for Washington's non-native plant species. So before I get into that, just a little bit about the Natural Heritage Program. We are a group that is within the Department of Natural Resources. Natural Heritage Programs in general are a nationwide network of groups that document the locations of rare species and rare and high quality ecosystems. Our database in Washington has over 7,000 records. We also help determine rare plant and ecosystem conservation priorities for the state, and we distribute our data to help guide conservation actions and inform land use decisions at a statewide level. So how do invasive species impact our work? Ecological integrity assessments are one of the major data products that we provide as a group from our ecological staff. They summarize the condition and integrity of occurrences of ecosystems through considerations of composition, structure, and other ecological processes. This includes a metric of invasive non-native species land cover as a reflection of the site's ecological health. The presence or absence of this, of invasive species, help point to a general measure of departure from historic norms for the ecosystem, but the extent to which a particular non-native species might impact ecological processes is a missing puzzle piece. So why do we measure invasive species? Well, they threaten native biodiversity in a couple different ways. We're concerned about the impact of invasives specifically on natural ecosystems. This is different from impacts of invasive plants on agriculture or horticultural systems. Economic impacts are measured differently than impacts on natural ecosystems. As such, species might not necessarily match all of the classic signs of an invasive plant, such as rapid growth, wall-to-wall monocultures, and still have an impact on native ecosystems. You can think about this in terms of like how cheatgrass carries fire over a landscape that may not necessarily have those wall-to-wall fires as a part of their natural ecosystem. Certain invasive plants can alter stream channels with their root systems. So we found that there's a regional data gap. We have a need for a standardized method to assess non-native plants relative to their impact on biodiversity and ecosystem function. Frequently noxious weed lists are very helpful, but not every noxious weed might have an impact on a natural ecosystem. So think of things that you might see on roadsides, but once you get off into the forest, they may not be causing too much of an issue there. Additionally, there are a lot of plants that aren't on the noxious weed list throughout Washington and throughout the state that also might cause problems for natural ecosystems that aren't on the noxious weed list. So we're looking at things that are both on and off current lists, essentially all non-native species that we find in Washington. So we also want this list to be scientifically defensible for consistent and objective application. A lot of our partners, Department of Ecology, for example, have expressed an interest in having a definitive list of non-native invasive species that need to be controlled in terms of things like wetland mitigation monitoring and being able to hold things to a certain standard. So having a standardized list will help those partners in terms of the word is getting away from me. A consistent application of regulations. We also want it to be a repeatable ranking process. we don't know all things about all species. New information becomes available seemingly almost every day. So we want to be able to update our rankings as new information is available or new non-native species are identified. So the first step for this program, which is kind of just getting started, is we're identifying our expert panels. We're going to have 2 expert panels, a smaller group, the scientific advisory panel, that will consist of several regional botanical experts, ecologists who have performed similar rankings in other regions. They're going to help us kind of develop this system and ensure that it's scientifically sound. And then we're going to have a ranking panel, which will involve a larger group of botanical, ecological, invasive species management experts throughout the state. They'll have experience with both native and non-native flora. We want to make sure that there's geographic, taxonomic, and management representation throughout the state. There's a lot of people with a lot of different experiences with invasive species, so we want to make sure that we're capturing all that information as best we can. They will then use the process developed by ourselves and the scientific advisory panel to rank or rate the invasive species. So as part of the development of the ranking protocol, we looked at a bunch of different assessment systems used by other groups. NatureServe is kind of the umbrella organization of which the Washington Natural Heritage Program is a member group. So NatureServe, we contribute a lot of data to NatureServe and get a lot of good resources back from them. They have an invasive species assessment protocol that they've developed, so we've been looking quite a bit at that. Our neighbors in Alaska have recently developed an invasiveness ranking program that's very similar to what our goals are. And California actually has several different invasive plant inventory systems that we have been looking at to kind of glean information on what could be useful for us in our state. The NatureServe system tends to have more questions about distribution and abundance, whereas the Alaska system has more questions about the physical attributes of the plants. Is it allelopathic? What's the reproductive strategy, etc. We'll probably borrow from all of these different systems in order to create our system. So one of the big questions is what's going to happen with invasive species individually when it comes to climate change. In the Alaska invasives ranking system for non-native plants of Alaska's, they had some interesting nexus with climate change. Alaska tends to have fewer invasive species than the contiguous US. By no means do they not have any at all, but there just has been more invasion when you have more land borders. So they put a lot of effort into figuring out which plants might become invasive in Alaska. And they did so using a kind of a climate screening system using Climax software. Alaska has 3 ecoregions, which is a biogeographical way to classify landscapes. They compared weather station data from the 3 ecosystems of Alaska with stations in the areas where non-native species that may not currently be found in Alaska were known to occur using the Climax software. There's evidence that invasive species can invade areas that are not necessarily perfectly climatically matched to theirs. So if the similarities in the 2 climates were greater than 40% match, it was considered potentially invasive in Alaska. They used the screening system to kind of figure out what species they wanted to rank. So they didn't, waste time on tropical plants that were never really going to have a threat to their non-tropical ecosystems. Another tool that we've used here in Washington at the Natural Heritage Program is the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. This was developed by NatureServe to assess the response of plant and animal species or vegetation types to projected climate change. It employs 29 climatic and biological variables to derive an overall vulnerability score ranging from extremely vulnerable to less vulnerable to climate change. We have mostly been focusing on species level for our CCVI projects. Those are done by our botanist, Walt Fertig. We've also looked at using some of those species level CCVI ratings to determine if some of our natural areas need to be or maybe should be expanded in order to compensate for habitat loss of these more vulnerable species. The way that we might apply this to our invasive species rating project is we may look at how vulnerable or invulnerable certain invasive plant species are. We may use some of the data from the native species or native ecosystems to identify what niches may be vacated due to climate change that might provide a foothold for invasive species. We recently gained funding through a different grant to develop a CCVI methodology for wetlands to determine the vulnerability of wetlands, certain wetland groups or types, and their vulnerability to climate change. So information about that may help us identify some areas that may become more vulnerable to invasion from invasive species and what species might fill those gaps. One of the challenges of evaluating any sort of climate-based change in Washington is we have such a variability in our habitats. So I mentioned ecoregions previously, but Washington is pretty unique. We have 9 ecoregions, which is quite a lot. If you, like we were just talking about Alaska, it's a much, much larger state. They only have 3 ecoregions. So we have a lot of climate variability throughout our state, and we want to look at how invasive species might impact all of these areas. So part of the process of developing the system will be to determine how we want to look at how these plants might impact natural ecosystems in different parts of the state. Something that's incredibly invasive in the Puget Trough may not necessarily be invasive in the Columbia Plateau and vice versa. So from there, we will have, once we determine what species are invasive or may become invasive in Washington, we want to think about how they impact these natural ecosystems. So we want to think about how they impact ecosystem processes, community structure, whether they have some sort of chemical impact through trophic levels, their mode of distribution, dispersal, allelopathy, competitive ability, etc. All of these can impact natural ecosystems in various ways, and we may not have information on all species for all of these different attributes. So some part of the challenge of this project is building into the math when we don't know, for example, how long the seed bank of one of these species might last, how we fold that into its overall ranking. One of the downsides when I was talking to the folks who did the Alaska training is of these ranking systems is that it kind of creates a false spectrum in some extent. The management ability of some of these highly invasive species may be coloring how people prioritize their management impact. So something that's highly invasive but maybe very, very difficult to control. Our colleagues in Alaska were finding that people are just throwing a lot of money at these like highly rated, highly invasive plants when maybe something a little bit lower down on the list may be more manageable. So one of the things that we're thinking about folding in is some factors for feasibility of control, which may help in addition to how they impact the ecosystems. The feasibility of control may help people prioritize how they want to address these species if they become introduced into the areas that they're managing. So the ranking panels, this is going to occur probably in the fall, winter of this year, will be mostly held virtually, which will hopefully allow people from all over the state to participate. We'll probably break people into smaller groups based on the species that they have the most experience with. We want to have a broad spectrum of people who work with or adjacent to non-native plants, not necessarily just academic botanists, not necessarily just the people who do treatments of invasive species, but we want everybody to be involved because everybody has a different perspective on these plants and see things in different areas. You know, a lot of times I find that you know, folks who work for an organization like mine maybe only see the highest quality areas, so their perspective can be colored by that, and things that seem super invasive to them or not really that much of a problem may be a bigger problem to those who work in areas like park systems that are more surrounded by development. So it's important to have everybody's perspective so that we don't artificially inflate some species ranks that may or may not be as big of a problem in all areas. So we have a lot of known non-native plants in the Washington flora. We have, you know, a little under 1,200 non-native plants in Washington. Almost 400 of those are considered waifs or sporadic escapes. So that's something that escaped from somebody's yard and was collected once in the herbarium, but hasn't really been collected widely throughout the state. Around 800 species could potentially impact natural ecosystems. There's around 200 species of invasive plants on priority noxious weed lists within the state. So part of this process is we want to identify high priority species from our panel members and make sure that we rank those to make sure that everybody's pet species, for lack of a better term, are being addressed, or things that may be becoming much more of a problem but haven't been seen throughout the state. We can look at those and see how those may impact Washington. We might potentially identify a specific ecosystem that we will start with work first, such as wetlands, to kind of beta test this system and then potentially expand it to other ecosystems as time goes on. And then we'll assign the scores. So the panel will use the protocol to assign the scores. We will integrate those individual scores into a final rank for each species. The scientific advisory panel may help us with some particularly contentious species if there's a wide gap in some rankings. And then we will roll those up into ranking reports. So this might be a document, it might be a website, it's likely going to be both. We want it to be something that will be easily modified, as we intend this to be an adaptable system. As we learn more about species or want to add species, we'll be able to update these reports for each species as they are ranked. So the outcomes of this project, we want a standardized ecological assessment of non-native plants. This will help assist the Washington Noxious Weed Control Board and Washington Invasive Species Council and other partners, and will identify species that may become problematic under future climate scenarios. And this is my question slide, but I believe if folks are putting questions in the chat, we are going to do that at the end of both presentations. So that's all I have, and I am going to try to kick it over to Emily.
Thank you, Irene.
All right, Emily, you should be the presenter now.
All right. Can everybody see that?
Looks good.
All right, great. Let's see. Yeah, so my name is Emily Fusco, and as Catherine said, I'm an ORISE fellow with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. But I'm today going to talk about my work from my time as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And we're going to focus on kind of our understanding of our state invasive plant regulatory lists. So plant regulatory lists exist in most state legislation, and they contain a list of regulated or prohibited plant taxa. So these lists are created in different ways, but typically their purpose is to restrict things like the sale or movement of a species because it has been shown to cause harm in some way, whether that be environmental or economic. And these regulations are most effective when they're proactive and prevent new invasive species from entering a state. So this is because a species, as it becomes more widespread, it's going to be more costly to eradicate. And once a species is widespread enough, eradication is typically not possible, and instead we're left with these costly and time-intensive methods for containment, or we may only be able to prioritize important areas for control or restoration. So you can see in this figure here that where management methods like prevention and eradication exist, they're really only possible before a species has become widespread. So these regulatory lists are more effective when they're consistent across state boundaries. So they're also more effective when they're consistent across these state boundaries, so that a neighboring state is not a source of problematic species for you. Making these lists proactive is also particularly important in places that are expected to become hotspots of invasion with climate change. So on the left here is a figure from a paper that Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley published in 2016, where they created species distribution models to 2050 under climate change for hundreds of invasive plants to predict suitable areas where they might survive with a new climate. And so the red areas are expected to be suitable for many new species that don't currently occur there. And listing these kinds of species for regulation proactively would be an opportunity to get ahead of these species before they're introduced, so we can really capitalize on the prevention part of the curve that we just saw. So for the first part of this talk, I'm going to focus on describing the current state of our invasive plant regulatory lists, because to make them effective, we really need to know what our starting point actually is. So all of this work in the first part here comes from a paper that was co-led by Eve Bury and myself. Catherine has shared a link to that paper in that handout that's in the chat. So for this project, what we did is compiled regulatory plant lists for each of the lower 48 states and asked these three questions. So 1, how consistent are these regulatory lists across states? 2, how proactive are the state regulatory lists? And then 3, how climate proactive are these state regulatory lists? And so to answer this first question of how consistent are these lists across states, we downloaded invasive plant legislation from each of the 48 states using this National Plant Board website. And once the lists were compiled, we found that there were a total of 553 unique plant taxa listed. The most commonly listed of these taxa were purple loosestrife and Canada thistle, and that 5 states did not have a regulatory list at all. So out of the states that did have lists, they ranged from listing 2 to 162 taxa. And it's important to note there's also a federal noxious weed list, and states tended to be pretty inconsistent with how they address that within their own legislation. So they might relist all of the federal species within their own legislation. They might pick a few of those to relist or not really list any at all. But effectively, these species are prohibited within the state anyway. So we just kind of excluded these federal species just to make the list more comparable across states. And so, as I said, the number of taxa listed across states varied greatly. It ranged from 2 to 162. So on the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as Wisconsin, they had lists with more than 100 taxa, while Louisiana, Georgia, Kentucky, New Jersey, and Rhode Island had no invasive plant regulatory lists. So in this map, the darker the state, the more taxa they had listed on their state regulatory list. And then here is a graph of the number of states where a taxa is regulated on the x-axis and the number of taxa on the y-axis. So what this graph shows is that most taxa are listed in just a few states. So that's that tall bar on the left. And then the most commonly listed taxa, the Canada thistle and purple loosestrife, they're the two super short bars on the far right. So it was really uncommon for any species to be listed this many times across the US. So we also found that when you paired adjacent states on average, they shared an average of 16.8% of the taxa on their list. So the highest overlap between pairs of states was in the Northeast and Massachusetts, which shared around 50% of their listed taxa with New Hampshire and Connecticut. And so you might be wondering, maybe these states are dealing with vastly different threats than their neighbors. And if that's the case, then maybe there shouldn't be a lot of overlap in these lists. But we found that on average, 66.5% of the taxa on each state's list was also included in at least one of their neighbors' lists. So it suggests that there is some general agreement among states that some taxa should be listed. It's just not consistent with all of the states surrounding each state. And so this map is showing where there was higher agreement in these regional groups that a taxa should be listed. So what does this mean in practice? It means that a lot of states aren't regulating taxa that their neighbors are concerned about. And so this is really problematic when you could be the source for a plant that your neighbor is trying to regulate. So here we're showing where states are not regulating taxa that their neighbors are concerned about and are regulating, and the taxa is present in that state. So the redder the states are here, these redder states are not being particularly helpful to their neighboring states. So in the Northwest, we have Idaho kind of coming in hot here in this dark red color, where they have more than 90 species that are present in their state, present and unregulated, but that at least one of their neighboring states is trying to regulate. So going back to this first question, how consistent are regulatory lists across states? The answer is not very. Most taxa are listed by very few states, and on average, state lists only overlap by about 16.8% with their neighbors. So we can also think about that in terms of the last red map that we just looked at, where some states have 90 or more of their neighbors' invasive plant taxa present and unregulated in their state. And so our next question here, we asked, how proactive are these regulatory lists? And so to answer this, we compiled county-level occurrence data for all of the listed taxa for each state. And this resulted in around 300,000 occurrence records. And just to note that we considered a taxa proactive if it was regulated in a state, but there were no occurrence records in that state. And so we found that there were 36 states that had at least one taxon listed proactively. And there were 165 cases where a taxon was totally proactive, meaning that there were 165 instances where a state listed a taxon that was not yet present. And so in this map, the number on the states indicates the total number of taxa that were listed proactively. And then the color indicates the percent of that state's regulatory list that was proactive. So the darker blue means that a larger percentage of taxa were listed proactively. And so the percent of regulatory lists that were proactive ranged from 0 in Arkansas, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, New Mexico, and Texas, to on the high end at around 50% in Delaware and Oklahoma. But on average, only 11% of our taxa were listed proactively. So the Northwestern states kind of fell out a bit in the middle here, with 5, 12, and 10 species listed proactively in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, which is about 5 to 15% of those state lists. So from here, though, we wanted to dig in a little bit deeper to this question to see how widespread each state's species are. And so instead of just looking at whether or not a species occurred, we wanted to recognize that there's a big difference between just one rogue occurrence in a state versus something that is widespread throughout the entire state. And so for the taxa that were present, we looked at their occurrences at the county level. So here on the x-axis, we have each of the lower 48 states with an invasive plant list. And on the y-axis, we have the percent of counties in which we had a record of that plant occurring within the state. So the states on the right, so the states are ordered from proactive on the left to kind of reactive on the right. And you can see, so for example, Arkansas had all the way on the left only 2 taxa listed, but they were present in fewer than 25% of the counties in that state. And there's a dotted line across here at 47%, and that shows how widespread taxa were on average across all of these states. So highlighted here, in case you haven't found them yet, are Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So they kind of fell out in the middle here. And on average, the taxa regulated in these states were already present in about half of those counties in the state. So for our question of how proactive are these state regulatory lists, the answer again is that it varies by state, but on average, they're not particularly proactive. And so onto this last question of, our last question was about how climate proactive these lists are. So we considered a species to be climate proactive if it was listed in a state that it was not yet present and that the state was projected to have suitable climate for by the year 2050. So we looked at those 165 proactive cases. So those cases where a species was not yet present, but was already regulated in a state. And we used this work that I mentioned before by Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley, where we had these distribution models for 65 of those 165 cases where the species were listed proactively. And so if a species was listed, not present, and would have suitable climate by 2050 based on 11 out of 13 climate models, we considered that to be a climate proactive case. So of the 65 cases that we were able to look at, 41 were considered climate proactive, and 21 states listed at least one climate proactive species. Oregon actually listed the most climate proactive species. So on the right here is a flyer produced by the Oregon Department of Agriculture with information about one of those species that came out as climate proactive on our list, which is this Ravenna grass. So providing information like this about species before they arrive can help with these early detection and rapid response efforts. And in all but 2 of the 41 cases that we looked at, the species had actually already had suitable climate in the states now. And so Ravenna grass falls into this category, and this flyer does say that it's been detected in one county in Oregon. So based on this, we can kind of determine also that some of these species already pose an immediate threat, and that threat might become worse with climate change. All right, so this question of how climate proactive are state regulatory lists, and we found again that they're not very climate proactive, but a lot of states did list at least one climate proactive species, and so that suggests that this could be a strategy we can employ to get ahead of this new wave of range-shifting invasive plants. So to recap, across the lower 48 states, lists are inconsistent across borders, and this can cause problems when neighboring states are a source of invasives for you. And these lists are also largely reactive, and these reactive lists miss opportunities for proactive strategies, which are more effective. So finally, the states also have this opportunity and ability to get ahead and list climate proactive species, and many states do this at least a little bit. But in general, the lists are not very forward-thinking since a lot of these species could already establish in a state now. And so that brings us on to this next question here. So why are our state lists so reactive and inconsistent? And so I'm going to spend the last little bit of the talk here talking about this work that was led by Bethany Bradley with other members of the Northeast RISC team, and it was recently published in Ecosphere. So a link to this paper has also been provided by Catherine. All right, so you saw how some of that inconsistency looked at the national scale, but we're going to focus on the Northeast region as a case study. So in the Northeast, there were a total of 128 species that were regulated. And so the Northeast is a smallish region with really small states and similar ecosystems across state borders. So it'd be reasonable to expect that they would probably want to regulate a lot of the same species. But out of this list of 128 total species, the Northeast states regulated roughly 1/4 to a little more than half of those species. And so that's what the numbers and colors are showing you here. So the darker states regulated a higher percentage of that 128 species pool. You can also see Rhode Island here, kind of in the bottom right, if you're not familiar with New England geography. So they're that white hash mark state, and they don't have a regulated list at all. And so it again brings us back to this question of why are these state lists so different? Because it seems like the high-risk species in this area should be really similar because the region is so small, but that's not necessarily reflected in their state regulatory lists. And so our regulatory lists are determined in large part by weed risk assessments. So that's a lot of what Irene was just talking about is how do you assess these different species for risk. And these weed risk assessments do feed directly into whether or not these species actually become regulated. And so in the Northeast and in other regions too, states each have their own unique assessment to determine whether a species is high risk enough to regulate. And so there are two main reasons why states using these assessments might end up regulating different sets of species though. So either they're choosing different species to evaluate from the start, or they're choosing the same species, but the evaluation process is so different that they end up making different decisions about whether the species is high risk and whether or not regulation is necessary. So for this first question of are states evaluating different species, we can see on the right here that to some extent they are. So out of this regional pool of 370 species that were actually evaluated in the Northeast, New York evaluated 361 of them, and that's that big brown circle, what that represents. But you can also see how many species each of the other states evaluated and the paired comparison on each of those lines that connect those dots. So for example, Massachusetts evaluated 88 species, and Maine evaluated 48. And of those species, Massachusetts and Maine evaluated just 39 of the same species. And so we can determine that at least some of the state differences in regulated species come from the fact that they are evaluating different species to begin with, but we can also look here at these weed risk assessments themselves. So to do this, we looked at each of the state assessments to see if they were using the same criteria for determining risk. And so this table that I'm showing here is just an example of some of the criteria that we found in each of the state weed risk assessments. And the X's here show whether or not a state had a question about that criteria. So Irene talked about some of these too. So looking at the plant distribution, for example, is something that might be really common on weed risk assessment. And so there are quite a few differences across the state assessments, but there were some really commonly evaluated things that most places did look at, and those included things like potential for naturalization, presence in natural areas, dispersal ability, impacts to native flora and fauna, and impacts to community composition. So another source of inconsistency might be that states are using different materials to assess risk. So for example, maybe some folks are sticking to journal articles or the gray literature while they're doing those weed risk assessments. versus some people that might be relying heavily on expert assessments as they're filling out those weed risk assessment forms. And so we found that when comparing New York and New Hampshire, which had 52 species in common that they evaluated, we found that for the most part, they were using very different sources. So you can see here in this bar chart that the dark areas where sources overlap, and that's very small in all of these cases. So the states are asking similar, but maybe different questions about the species they evaluate, but they're also using different sources to answer those questions. But despite all of these differences in the weed risk assessments, we found that for the most part, states regulated most of the species that they evaluated. And so, for example, in Maine, they evaluated 48 species and 43 were ultimately regulated. In Massachusetts, 90 were evaluated and 69 were eventually regulated. And so the only exception to this was in New York, where they evaluated 361 species, way more than any other state, and only 69 were regulated. So this suggests that for the most part, if states evaluated the same species, these lists would become a lot more consistent, regardless of what the weed risk assessments are actually looking for and how they are assessing plants in those assessments. So as far as whether states were making these lists climate proactive, we found that nothing in the weed risk assessments explicitly excluded range-shifting species from being regulated, but there were things that made them come out as having lower priority for regulation. And so states might limit the geographic scope of which species can be considered, like it must be found elsewhere in New England or within the Northeast. And so in these kinds of instances, a range-shifting species might not be considered high enough risk and high enough priority until it's really close to the state that is evaluating that species. And so there are a number of ways that we can increase consistency and proactivity in our state lists. And these include evaluating consistent sets of species and sharing completed risk assessments with other states to help reduce the time and effort it takes to complete an assessment. And then to increase the climate proactivity, states might want to consider including range-shifting species in their lists of evaluated species or adding climate change-specific criteria to their assessments. And on the right is just a flow chart that outlines ways to increase consistency and proactivity in these state-regulated lists. So to recap, our state invasive plant regulatory lists are inconsistent across borders, and they're reactive and focus on species that are often already widespread. But we found that we can probably increase this consistency and proactivity by evaluating our neighbors' regulated species and evaluating our potential range-shifting species. And I will end with that, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Irene, for your great presentation. We will go ahead and start our Q&A now. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will try our best to answer them all. Also, you should be able to raise your hand to ask a question, and I have the capability to unmute you so you can ask your question instead of typing it in. So Deb, if you want to kick us off with our Q&A.
Yeah, I'm happy to. We had some questions roll in, and as Catherine mentioned, feel free to either raise your hand or put those questions in the chat, and we'll see what we can get to in our remaining 10 or so minutes. I'll start with a couple of questions for Irene that came in. Dominique was asking about the Climate Change Vulnerability Index and the fact that it doesn't include adaptive capacity, and was wondering if that affects your decision making around creating this framework.
You know, I personally haven't worked in any of our CCDI projects, so I'm still kind of learning about this process. Adaptability, while not being a part of CCDI, is something that we're going to look at with other metrics. So, you know, some of it's going to be a proxy. We have, you know, our climate models, but we're not sure exactly how these plants are going to react to certain climate conditions, or what exactly is going to happen, and certainly climate change is going to impact different parts of our state differently. So adaptability of these species is something that we're going to look at, but probably not through the CCVI metrics.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And then Christina had a question as to whether soil type or the history of soil disturbance is a factor that you're looking at when you're considering species rankings.
Sure. One thing that we do look at in our ecological integrity assessments is the disturbance to soils. So as we know, a lot of invasive species are particularly adapted to disturbance. Sometimes they can't really get a foothold unless there's some sort of disturbance. So how species react to disturbance is definitely something that we're going to look at. That's kind of one of the main crux issues of, does something become invasive in otherwise unimpacted ecological systems, or do they need some sort of, a road being put through in order to become established? Do they spread into systems that don't have any type of soil or other disturbance otherwise? So that's definitely something we're going to look at.
Great. Thank you for that. So this is a question that Taylor wrote in, and I actually think either or both of you could respond to this question. With a shifting climate, is there any consideration in these assessments of the viability of attempting to maintain native species that may no longer be compatible with, say, a warmer, drier climate? Are there expected changes? If you have any thoughts on that.
One of the projects that we looked at with our CCVI was whether we should expand some of our natural areas in order to help maintain those plant populations that may be impacted by climate change. So that is a consideration that we're looking at. It's one of those things that's hard to predict, but that's all I can answer for that question from my perspective. Maybe Emily has more she can add.
Yeah, so in a lot of these assessments that we looked at anyway, there were often questions about whether these invasives would impact native communities. But as far as kind of, any kind of combined impacts with climate change and that invasive, or whether these communities would become more vulnerable with climate change, that's not anything that we've seen explicitly included. And it's a really difficult thing to try to include, but certainly is something that might be worth considering when you are trying to factor in the vulnerability of native plants and native communities.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Definitely important and difficult question. Emily, I was interested when you showed the state's rankings, and of course I zoomed in on Washington State, which doesn't look like it's being particularly proactive in its listing of invasive species. I think you pointed out, if I got that takeaway right. And I was curious whether or not you see the work that Irene's team doing as helping Washington State become more proactive on listing. And then I'll actually ask a second part of that question of Irene, which is Emily's work looking at these mismatches in regulated and evaluated species giving you any ideas for your work moving forward? So maybe we'll start with you, Emily, for the first part of that.
Sure. Yeah. So I will say, Washington was kind of in the middle in terms of how proactive these lists seem to be. There's not, I wouldn't necessarily say that these lists should be 100% proactive, right? Because part of what is really useful about these lists is that you can prevent things from coming in, but they're also used as a way to help folks prioritize work that's being done in the state. So, for species that are already there, and that's another really important function of these lists. And so probably some mix of proactive and reactive is what would be useful. But given that we know that we can be a lot more effective in our management when we are proactive. It seems that it could be really useful to have some more focus on these proactive species. And based on what Irene is working on, it looks like they are putting in some really great thought into what makes a good weed risk assessment. And that's a really complicated thing to do. So yeah, I think that, she said there were definitely some distribution related questions in there and that kind of thing. And so that's all stuff that could be used to tailor these lists to be more proactive.
Great. And Irene, any thoughts to add?
Sure. One of the things that the list is going to be produced from our project is not a regulatory list. It may help inform regulatory lists, but it's not itself going to be regulatory. One of the interesting things about regulatory lists is, depending on what state you're in, and I'm sure Emily's much more of an expert on this than I am, but in order for something to be listed, sometimes there's quite a large hurdle in order for it to be on the list, because it needs to have some sort of economic impact, because there's a lot of money involved when it comes to what's on these lists. A lot of times if something is on the noxious weed list, it triggers a requirement from land managers to spend time and money to manage that species. So one question I have for Emily, from panelist to panelist, is when you were doing these analyses, I know a lot of states have pretty extensive watch lists that aren't necessarily technically listed, but there's a lot more flexibility when it comes to being an invasive species coordinator in states to put things on a watch list rather than to be officially on the noxious weed list. So I wonder if you looked at those lists as well to look at any overlap between states there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, there are all sorts of types of lists that states can have. So for this analysis, we stuck with just the regulatory lists, because really once you start to try to span out from there, there's so much going on in these kind of more unofficial lists. And so we did not analyze those. And there is a lot more that goes into getting stuff usually onto these regulatory lists than just this weed risk assessment. These are like legislated lists. And so we chose really to stick there, largely in some ways just because those were like that's where the teeth are. So like we actually have some enforcement capacity with those kinds of lists versus these kinds of unofficial kinds of watch lists and stuff that are really useful for people on the ground managing, but that are not necessarily enforceable in any way.
Great, thank you. And I just want to make a note that Nicole wrote in with a comment that adding species adaptive capacity to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index is actually a priority currently being addressed by the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So folks interested in that issue can go check out Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center maybe for some of that information as well. I see we are coming up on just a few minutes to the hour. I want to just check back in with Catherine, see if there's any outstanding questions we haven't answered, and then I will turn it over to you to wrap up.
Well, we have a couple questions left, but I want to make sure to, since we have probably less than a minute, that let me share this. Well, okay, I'll get my slide up in a second, but that I make sure to provide you all again some information on how to contact Northwest RISC and to kind of open the invitation to contact us with interest you might have in joining our advisory team, but also any topics you might want to see us talk about in webinars or research you're interested in, or if you're interested in presenting your own research in a future webinar or attending one of our meetings, please feel free to reach out via our Gmail address, northwestrisk@gmail.com. And you can check out our website as well for all of our webinar recordings and information about the network overall. And the recording of today will be on our website and on our YouTube channel. I think we're just about at the hour. Is there anything, like last words from our presenters you'd like to share before we head off today?
Just thanks for having us. And I think our contact information is in that handout. So if anyone has any questions or wants to join in on my ranking panels, send me an email.
All right, ditto to what Irene said. Thanks for having us, and definitely reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you both so much, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you all for attending. Bye.